Present. Sid Gardner.
Here.
Dean Hollingsworth.
Present.
Catalina Nebaya.
Présent.
Councillors Maurice Dupel.
Present.
Glenn Grant.
Present.
Justin Towndale.
Present.
And Eric Bergeron.
Present.
Councillor Todd Bennett is on his way. Oh,
He's
there
here.
he is.
He's just he walked out.
Just walked in?
Taking a walk.
The one time I walked up?
There he is.
Adoption of the agenda. Need a motion. Councillor Gardner and Councillor McDonald. Any discussion? All in favor? Carried. Any disclosure of interest? Seeing none, we'll go to presentations, and I'll just start by recognizing the CAO and ask her for a introduction before we go to our speaker.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So this evening, we have our procedural bylaw in front of council. There are some changes per the Municipal Act that have to be incorporated into the procedural bylaw. One of them, for example, is being able to participate through electronic means, which council has dealt with in a previous report. Also, with respect to the procedural bylaw, we thought this was a good opportunity for council to hear from Mr. Fleming. Mr. Fleming is available to provide some guidance. If there are certain things within the procedural bylaw that council perhaps would like to change, he can help us with some best practice for other municipalities. But again, kind of back to council, this is your procedural bylaw, so we would like to make it work for council. The one significant thing that has been removed from the procedural bylaw is information with respect to committees of council. And in speaking with Mr. Fleming, one of his recommendations is some municipalities deal with that via a separate bylaw for committees. And I think the advantage of that is that if your committee, your number of committees or the list of committees changes, for example, that's done separately through a bylaw and doesn't have to affect your procedural bylaw. And what it would allow too is at the beginning of every term of council, you can revisit those committees and that bylaw all to itself, which I think is, like procedurally, I think that's a good process for both council and administration. So those are just some of our initial thoughts. With it, I think we want to hand it over to Tony. I think we want to encourage any questions or feedback from council. We're not looking for the procedural bylaw to be approved this evening. We're looking for your feedback, and then administration, in conjunction with Mr. Fleming, can come back at a future meeting and have some of the amendments and changes made per council's instructions.
So I'll just pick up on that. So I'll just say again, we're not necessarily having to pass this procedural bylaw tonight. We do want to get some feedback. I want to welcome you, Mr. Fleming. The last time we saw you was at NAV because you were part of a team building orientation session. And so we had a very good discussion with you around code of conduct, and basically we were still a new council then. We're now a year in, so we're a little bit more gelled as a group, and so we're happy to have you here. Because we're starting later than expected, we have food coming in at about 5:30, so we may, if we're not finished, take a break, grab food, and then continue the meeting, because we have an in-camera session scheduled at 6, which we might like to get to, because we have other matters on our regular council agenda as well. Is that okay?
I'm in council's hands.
Okay. So, welcome. Do you want to take questions as you proceed? Is that
Absolutely, Your Worship.
right?
I mean, since I am late to the party, I don't want to shortchange council in terms of questions. So, you have the procedural bylaw in front of you. I'm happy to do it any number of ways, whatever works for council, Your Worship. I can just deal with questions, or I can go through a couple of sections that I think are interesting and might help with some discussion to sort of jumpstart things.
Yeah, I would prefer that you lead that, and then generally this council will not be shy to jump in and ask you questions, but we do appreciate you going through the work that you've put into already and highlight those pieces that are important.
So what I'll do then is I'll start with Article 3, which is the general provisions. And just, it's a good place to start because 3.1 talks about the fact that with a 2/3 majority, you can suspend the rules in your procedural bylaw. So the important thing for council to remember as your CAO just indicated, this is your procedural bylaw. So it sets the rules that you will generally follow, but in certain circumstances, if it's appropriate, with a 2/3 majority vote of council, you can waive these bylaw, or this bylaw for certain procedural matters. So obviously you don't want to do that every time, but it is in your hands to do that.
Councillor Grant.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Welcome, Tony. This evening, for an example, when we realized that we're going to be late, our in-camera meeting starts at 6 normally. So by 2/3 majority of the council, could we have changed that time to 4 o'clock?
Through you, your worship, yes, you could have. So, and that's a kind of procedural matter where council can decide that because your lawyer's late for the meeting, you might as well do something while you're all sitting around waiting for him, and you could have dealt with that. So unless there would be some reason to suggest that that would deprive someone of fair process. So if you were doing a planning advisory committee meeting and you had set the time for 6, I would be less inclined to suggest to you that moving it to 4 would be appropriate, because people will have decided to come or not come at 6 o'clock to speak to that matter. So you would in that case be depriving them of the ability to speak to the matter. And the Planning Act says that you must allow people to speak for and against a matter. But in this case, because it's a closed session, it's only council dealing with it, that would be appropriate.
Even with the media us having an obligation around advising the media around that?
The only thing the media would miss in that case would be you opening the meeting and moving into closed session. So if there was something to be reported out, perhaps waiting to report out for your regularly scheduled session, that would correct any sort of transparency issues or the ability for the public to know that there had been a closed session.
Okay, that's interesting.
The
That's
things to
not, that's
think
not how
about.
we understood it, so, okay.
Mhm.
Councillor Hollingsworth, and then Councillor McIntosh.
My question's already been answered, Your Worship.
Councillor McIntosh?
What if in the case of a member of council wasn't planning to be here to listen to Mr. Fleming, but wanted to be here for the closed meeting because there was an item that they were very concerned about, and we moved the meeting to 4, and he arrives at 5 minutes over, and he goes, what happened?
That's something council would need to consider when you're deciding whether it's appropriate to do that change to your procedure. And as it says, it's a 2/3 majority. So on that issue, that would be the discussion council could have as to whether it's appropriate to do that. So if it was a ward councillor who wouldn't be there for that, then it might be appropriate for council to say, well, even though it would be expedient for us to deal with it, it wouldn't be fair for the ward councillor.
Thank you.
All right. So if, we can move on. The rest, or not the rest, what follows are some pretty standard provisions in terms of time of meeting, scheduling, that sort of thing. The next piece that I wanted to spend some time with is Article 8, which is rules of debate. And specifically, in 8.7, there's a time limit that's been included for 3 minutes for council presentation. So as a group, you'll have to decide, is that enough time, not enough time? Should there be provision to extend that time? Questions should be made through the chair, 8.8, that's fairly standard, obviously, to make sure that everybody can follow along. Motions have to be seconded before there's a debate. Again, fairly standard until you have the question properly on the floor. There shouldn't be a debate on the matter. And again, those are fairly standard provisions. Article 9 speaks to order of business. So this is generally what the structure of your agenda will look like. Again, fairly standard. Article 10, quorum, I don't think we need to spend too much time on that. Committee of the Whole, again, just setting out how your Committee of the Whole system is going to work.
Councillor McIntosh has a question?
Can we go back to 8.7?
Of course.
No members will speak more than 3 minutes?
Yes.
We've gone, I've been here 5 years and I've never seen that enforced. When it comes to people speaking more than once, again, who makes the call on that? Could I, as a member, say to the chair, wait a minute, he's up there for 6 minutes?
The time limit is generally at the call of the chair. If there was an issue with, adhering strictly to that 3-minute time limit, you could call a point of order, and then the chair would make a ruling on that point of order. If 3 minutes doesn't work for this council, that's something you as a group need to think about. In terms of, is 3 minutes enough? Should it be the rule? But in fact, if you're breaching the rule every time everyone speaks, 3 minutes probably isn't the right rule. But against that, you need to balance how long do you folks want to enjoy each other's company every Monday afternoon or evening or whenever you do it. So one of those things that you just balance that amongst yourselves in terms of what works for you.
Just that in the previous term, the mayor, I mentioned a few times where somebody got up and spoke 5 times on one subject, and he said,
Right.
that's debate, and I have no problem with that, so.
Right.
He ruled on that. Is that what?
Well, and that is the chair's role, is to govern the debate. So in my experience, most times the chair will determine whether the debate is actually moving the matter forward. And so long as the matter is moving forward and you're not repeating yourselves and not actually advancing the debate, most of the time the chair will allow that to happen, because obviously that debate is what's going to get good bylaws or good resolutions and make sure everybody understands what it is you're doing. There may be amendments that need to be dealt with, and that might take, some more time. And really, it's all about trying to establish some baseline rules so that if things are not progressing, then there are rules that the chair can refer to say, all right, council, everyone has had their 1 time or 2 times at the call of the chair. Now we have to call the question.
That's reasonable.
Councillor Iban?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. 2 things, just to follow up on the last comment on time. I've seen a council chamber, I'm going to assume it's Brockville, because I think it's the only other one I've been in, where they have behind the mayor a time clock. And so every time, I assume it's Brockville, I could be wrong there, a councillor starts to speak, I think the clerk or the deputy clerk presses a button and it counts down. And I don't know if there's like a buzzer, but anyways, just some thought, because we can be a little long-winded. We're all quite passionate. But my question is, when it comes to the communication report, not communication, consent items and items, so I'm talking about the structure of the agenda, and the bylaws, we can vote on them in one swoop as a consent item, I suppose we call them. And I think there has been a bit of discussion about tenders and potentially doing it at tenders. So the clerk would then read that council passed tenders XYZ01 to XYZ07 be read and approved at once. Would this be the time where we would make that amendment so that tenders would then be approved in a consent, as one consent item?
Through
Mr.
your
Fleming.
worship, you could certainly add that to your consent agenda item. And always, council obviously can have certain line items, even from the consent agenda, pulled
Right.
for discussion. So if there is no discussion on 10 tenders and everyone's satisfied that it's appropriate, you followed your procurement bylaw, I see no reason why you couldn't pass them all at once.
Okay, so would we then, at this meeting, vote to see this reflected in the actual procedural bylaw when it comes back to us? Is this a motion that I would have to make, or,
Madam Clerk?
and,
Madam Mayor, I think it's up to you if you want formal motions or if you want this to be a consensus type of discussion.
Mr. Fleming?
I think at this point, your worship, what staff would probably appreciate is some direction
Right.
from council. So whether you do that by way of formal motion that's voted on, or whether there's merely a consensus to provide direction for staff, it's really the comfort level of staff, I suppose, and yourself and council as to how you'd like to proceed.
Well, I'm going to check in with the CAO, and then I'll see what council thinks. But would administration prefer that we give you a laundry list of things to consider, and that you would bring back to us, and that we would have debate at that time? Or would you prefer that we make motions as we go along this evening?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think for something like this, if we could get some consensus from council this evening, then what we will do is we will structure, when we bring the procedural bylaw back at a future meeting to get council's approval, that will be included. And if it meets council's expectations, then it'll get, but it can still be changed, right? So if something happens between now and we bring the procedural bylaw back, if there's something that council has decided not to proceed with that, then there's, you know, we're not asking for approval of the bylaw tonight. But otherwise, if we have a list of several items, then when we bring the procedural bylaw back, you're gonna be going through all of those components, or whether you vote on them individually or just as the procedural bylaw as a whole. So how I envision Councillor Heber's motion is that we would move our tenders and RFPs to the consent portion of the agenda. Council could make a decision when they adopt the agenda or make changes whether or not they want to move one of those items from consent to communications.
So do we have consensus on just building a list, or do we need to, or do we want Councillor Hébert to make a motion to that effect, or do we want to consider a list that comes back to us?
I think a motion gives clear direction to administration. That's just my opinion.
Okay.
There are others who.
Well, it means you debate every single motion then, right?
Yes?
Because we could say no, we don't agree.
If you're good with the list and then debate it when it comes back, I'd be okay with that.
Are you making a motion to that effect?
So are we going to go with the list? Councillor Hébert, is that okay? And then we'll debate at another time?
Sure.
Unless somebody strenuously objects to it, it's not a bad.
Am I seeing any strenuous objections? I am not. Okay, so first thing on the list is Councillor Hébert's, which we have discussed around this
Right,
table
yeah,
before.
yeah, yeah.
So I assume administration is taking notes. All right. So I have Councillor Hollingsworth, Councillor Gardner, and then Councillor Grant on the speaking list. Councillor Hollingsworth.
I'll try to say everything I need to say and be done with it.
Should I time you, sir?
Yes.
Well, do we have the punch clock?
Every time.
No, but I can.
On page 3, if you look at absenteeism, or sorry, abstention, where I get to refuse to vote. Okay, so we've got a water meter vote. You know, if we vote in favor of it, people might get angry, so we can conceivably, well, sorry, page 3.
Yeah.
As it reads there, abstention means refusal to vote either for or against, right? Well, technically speaking, if I'm reading this right, if 10 councillors or 9 councillors choose to abstain, and 1 councillor says, okay, I'm gonna vote in favor of it, does that mean that that now carries the day because everybody else just chose not to vote in favor or opposed?
So we've jumped back to
That's okay.
abstention.
I'm
Is
sorry
that,
if
is that,
I realized I just, it's sort of stuck in my craw, sorry.
it's okay. I
That's
just
o-
saw a couple of councillors sort of going, are we out of sequence? But we're jumping back to,
Or do you want to stay in order, because I can wait.
Page 1.
no,
Let's
it
hear
seems
the
like,
answer.
it seems like we're just going to, there's a lot of questions and we'll go with that. So we're on the 2.1 abstention?
Yeah.
Okay,
And
Mr.
I'm-
Fleming.
Thank you, Worship. And I'll actually jump ahead to answer your question.
Okay.
So if you look at section 20.3,
Yep.
and this is something that I didn't particularly clean up because I wanted to leave it to figure out how council wanted to deal with this. So 20.3 says, failure to vote by a member who's not disqualified, which would be conflict of interest, and who has not indicated that she or he abstains, shall be deemed to be a negative vote. But then if you look at 20.10, a member abstaining from voting will result in a negative vote. So we need to reconcile what you want to do
Yes.
with an abstention. And I'm going to add another little layer of complexity just to make it interesting. If you call a recorded vote and you abstain from voting, the Municipal Act provides that that is a negative vote. So the only time you are not given a choice procedurally is where there's a recorded vote. So if all of you are at a vote point and someone calls for a recorded vote and you abstain from voting, you're actually voting in the negative. However, the way the bylaw could be drafted is if it was a normal vote that is not recorded, your abstention can either be considered a negative or it could simply not count towards the vote. That, in those circumstances, in the non-recorded sense, you have a choice procedurally how you'd like to move this forward. The way it's drafted here, it's a negative vote always when you're abstaining. So long as council appreciates that if you abstain, you're really voting in the negative, that's okay. In that case, I don't know why you would actually abstain, because you might as well just vote in the negative.
Why even put it in your
Exactly.
bylaw? when
That's
you know
right.
It's understood if you're abstaining.
So I would just want to make sure that council would know that abstaining really is a negative vote, because in most people's minds, abstaining wouldn't necessarily mean you're voting in the negative. So that's something for you to consider and to think about moving forward. But to your specific question, the way the procedural bylaw is drafted, you actually don't get to your question, because it would always be, 10 abstentions would be 10 negative votes.
So, in essence, 2.1 sort of doesn't really even need to be there?
It's
Because-
an option that's available, but practically speaking, the way the procedural bylaw is drafted, it doesn't do what you think it's doing.
Yeah, you don't get to get out of it.
You don't get to get out of it. You're actually doing the opposite. You're voting against.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's fine.
So what do you recommend here for clarity?
So for clarity, I never like to put the actual rules in the definitions. I think
No.
that just confuses things. So I'm fine with the abstention as drafted.
Right.
What I'm suggesting would be make 20.3 and 20.10 an actual abstention, if that's what you want, or just take abstention out completely. I think there's some value in leaving abstention in, so long as it's not a negative vote, so that there may be reasons why a member simply does not want to vote on a certain matter that isn't to do with a conflict of interest or whatever. So I don't have a problem with leaving an abstention in that would not count either for or against the motion. You just need to make that clear in your procedural bylaw. And it's already clear in 20.7 that where there's a recorded vote, that will be a negative. So that 20.7 is correct. And then you just need to take 20.3 and 20.10 and decide what you'd like to do with them.
Okay, so do we have any consensus on this, or do we want to add this to the list?
I have a question.
I have Councillor Gardner, Grant, and Bennett on the speaking list, so why don't we hold to that for now? Councillor Gardner?
No, I don't care. You can move forward on this one.
Okay.
Doesn't matter to me.
Councillor Grant, did you want to speak to
Well,
this
just
specific?
to be consistent, whether it's a recorded vote, it's a negative vote, and so it should be the same whether it's a recorded vote or not. That way, there's some consistency with the act, as Tony just said. So there's consistency that it's a negative vote, whether it's a recorded vote or just a regular vote.
Madam CAO, did you want to speak?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I would like to speak briefly. We did have a scenario in our last term of council where we had a councillor during a recorded vote that abstained. And the reason why I would like to see the wording included in the procedural bylaw is that sometimes that comes up when it's a very, it could be a very debatable topic, it could be a little bit contentious, and I like to see it clearly defined in our procedural bylaw so that council will know, or most of council might recognize that an abstention is a negative vote, as opposed to allowing a decision. So if an abstention were to occur on a recorded vote and procedurally it's not in here, and depending on, we need to be as administrators aware that the rules are what the rules are, but to me it's clearer if it's in the procedural bylaw, because I wouldn't want a vote of something to occur that we need to now come back at a future meeting and say, so we handled that vote incorrectly, we need to record it as something differently. So I just know that sometimes with new councils, and so we want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to review the procedural bylaw when they become a new councillor. But abstention seems to be, in my view, a term that sometimes gets used. People understand it as a way to not vote. So my preference would be just to have that indicated, that per Councillor Hollingsworth comments as well, that an abstention is a negative vote.
Negative vote. That's what
Councillor Bennett, you had a question.
Yeah, if somebody was to, let's say if I was planning on abstaining from a vote, is it proper for me to take part in the debate?
Through your worship, there's no reason why, absent a conflict of interest declaration, that you couldn't participate in the debate regardless of how you intended to vote or whether you intended to abstain.
Okay, thanks.
So for clarity, what do you recommend? I'm back to my question,
Sure.
Mr. Fleming.
For clarity, I think you need to have, you can leave it the way it is in the bylaw, and then everyone will know that an abstention is a negative vote. That's clear.
Okay.
If you don't want that process, then simply reverse the language in point 3 and point 10 so that it's clear.
Everybody okay with that? Councillor Gardner?
Well, if you're reversing 20.3 and 20.10, it's a conflict of each other as far as I'm concerned. I mean, an abstention is an abstention, it's a no vote, it's a negative vote as far as I'm concerned, because you're not voting on for or pro or con. So it should stay the same. A negative vote is, or an abstention
Yeah,
is
that's-
a negative vote no matter.
That's the consent,
Why you go.
that's the consensus around the table, so Mr. Fleming is going to contract or or make sure that that's clear, is that it?
Yeah, I think what 20.3 is saying is if you don't vote and you haven't declared that you're abstaining, that's a negative vote. And if you do abstain in 20.10, that's also a negative vote. So I think what it's just trying to do is make it clear to council that if you do not vote, regardless of how that happens, absent a proper disqualification because of a conflict, your vote is a negative. Regardless of why you didn't vote.
Can you edit that down to make it clearer?
Certainly.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. So I will go back to the speaking list. Councillor Gardner, did we,
It's just a note that's sitting in your chair a number of years ago. I did use the 3-minute because of using my watch, because we had repetition, as you brought forward before, and pontification is the word that I like to use when people go on and on and on and don't say anything. So the 3-minute vote is a 3-minute time limit is a good thing. I've used it and it works. And people were upset at me and I didn't care. So there we go.
okay. Councillor Grant, did you want to come back? Because I'm now adding Councillor McIntosh, then I have Councillor Bennett.
I just need clarification on 8.7 because it's a little bit contrary to what Tony said.
Okay.
Basically, no member shall speak more than once to a main question without approval of council. So that to me, that would mean that all of council and not the chair.
The way it's drafted, your worship, that is how it's drafted. I was speaking of practice that I've seen in other municipalities where it's at the call of the chair. So, and again, that's council's decision whether you want to have that a council decision as opposed to the chair's decision.
Well, I find our meetings are too long to start off with, and to allow people to talk 2 or 3 times. If the chair is like the last chair, and I'm not being totally critical here, just a little bit critical, that person allowed numerous times to speak, which and it wasn't basically to bring new information, it was for further argument. And so, to me, I like it without approval of council. That way it takes all of council and then you feel involved rather than the chair question. This chair is doing an excellent job. I'm not criticizing her at all. So I like the language in there the way it is, and that council gets to, and so that's my point of view, that it's in here, let's keep it. The other thing, I was at a meeting the other day, one of our committees, and we talked about a recorded vote, and the chair said, I would like a recorded vote, and I said, no, the chair can't make that ruling, and it's up to, or make that, it's up to the members of the committee. And I've been wrong before, so I'm just wondering, but I looked through everything and talked about recorded vote, and there's nothing in there that says who can make a recorded vote, which means that, should mean that anybody can, is that correct?
Through you, Your Worship, unless the bylaw specifically speaks to who can make that request, it's my view that any member of council could ask for a recorded vote.
Okay, good, thank you. Wrong again.
Councillor McIntosh and then Councillor McDonald.
Yeah. Look, this is a stretch, but is there a loophole in the 23? We call a vote, the vote starts going on the table, and I get up and I leave the room because I don't want to vote. I'm talking about abstention. Rather than saying that, I just get up and leave the room. I haven't declared anything. Is that a bit of a loophole? And,
I'm just, through your worship, I'm just seeing if there's something in here. Yeah, 20.9, a member not in their seat when the question is called by the chair is not entitled to vote on that question, and in the case of a recorded vote, shall be recorded as absent. So
I avoid the negative.
you avoid the negative consequence.
Huh.
You're all by yourself, Madam Mayor.
Councillor Mac. It could happen. Councillor Councillor McDonald.
Yes, I would like the issue of whether it's council or the chair who allows a second kick at the can to anybody
Go
on
ahead.
the list, please.
Okay. You want to debate that one?
At another time, so just
Sure.
list it.
So we're not automatically going to keep it in the way it is now. Okay. Anyone else, or should we let Mr. Fleming continue? Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Worship.
See what I'm dealing with here.
No comment, Your Worship. Well, let's move to Article 16, resolutions, notices of motion. So this, notices of motion are usually an interesting topic for most councils, so we're trying to put a little bit of clarity around process. Notice of motion 16.3 shall be introduced in writing. And I notice there's a typo on the first line, staff has an L in it, so that should be fixed up. So this is when you want to amend, repeal, alter a bylaw, pre-approved budget, or any motion previously approved by council, or change established policies. All that does is make sure that staff, the public, know that in advance there will be a notice of motion so it can get properly put on the agenda. That's 16.5, requiring that it be on the council agenda so it can be introduced. I'm not sure if there are any discussion points or questions on notices of motion, but that's something you can read and make sure that the process works for you. 18 and 17 are just talking about, or actually 18 deals with declarations. We spoke about that at our last session when we were doing orientation, so I don't intend to speak to that too much, or at all actually. I did want to speak to Article 19, which is new business or...
Councillor McDonald?
Oh,
Sorry,
sure.
Mr. Fleming.
Back to notice of motion, I would just love to have an explanation at some point of if you come in with an issue you want to raise, can you make a motion or must you do a notice of motion? And what helps you decide which it's going to be? Do you title your spiel motion or a notice of motion? So at some point, I'd love a little lesson on that.
Through your worship,
Mr.
so
Clement.
the way the bylaw is drafted now, if you want to bring a motion, what you do is called a notice of motion. It's in writing and it's presented, and that will then be put on the agenda for the next meeting or however you procedurally want to do that. I don't think there's any magic in whether it's called a motion or a notice of motion. The real issue will be timing, because for the most part, there won't be this sense of urgency that requires an amendment to your agenda to deal with a motion for effectively new business at that council meeting. That can be placed on the next agenda through a notice of motion. And if you wanted to bring something by way of notice of motion at the meeting without previously having brought it in writing so it could be placed on the agenda, then again, you revert back to 2-point or 3-point, whatever I talked about earlier in terms of 2/3 majority of council to amend the agenda at that meeting to allow a new matter to be placed on the agenda.
Thank you.
And then there'll be the debate amongst council, does it need to be dealt with tonight? or is there a reason why we have to deal with it tonight, or can it be brought to another meeting? And that's a 2/3 majority.
Thank you.
I have Councillor Bergeron and then Councillor Gardner.
Thank you. Can you talk maybe about the difference between a new business motion and a notice of motion? We do have 2 new business motions tonight on the agenda that I think don't qualify for what you're talking about, but maybe an explanation from the clerk about our conversation earlier today about why it would qualify. It's a little bit vague here, or gray.
Mr.
Through your
Fleming?
worship, if you look at Article 19, that's where new business or unfinished business is found. The way it's defined currently is all matters brought forward for consideration that have not been disposed of or that has been referred to committee to a future date is put under a pending list and considered unfinished business, and that's going to provide some direction. And then if you look at 19.2, any item of business that's of a routine nature that's been introduced to members of council requiring a formal resolution that was not previously placed on the agenda shall be considered as a new business motion. So that's talking about routine matters, and there's some vagaries, of course, in what that routine means. And then if you look at 19.6, new business motions that are not of a routine matter shall be received and read by the clerk as a notice of motion. So I think the distinction that's trying to be introduced here is if it's something that's very routine, then it can be dealt with as a new business item, or if it's something that's a carryover from a previous sort of list of things that didn't get dealt with, that could be dealt with as new business and wouldn't necessarily require a notice of motion to be placed on the agenda.
So just to
Councillor
follow up,
Bergeron?
a report is considered routine business, asking administration for a report.
Well, that's really up to council. This is your process. So if the asking of a report would be a significant matter in terms of staff time, resources required, or something that wasn't formally on council's agenda previously that was brought forward, I suppose there could be an argument that it wouldn't fall into that sort of quote-unquote routine character. Again, I think that would require a ruling from the chair as to whether or not it falls within that category or not. And then there could be an appeal to the chair on that ruling, which is provided for in your procedural bylaw. And then the ruling of the chair would be final in terms of whether it is or is not routine.
So last thing, the 19.4 talks about 12 noon on the Tuesday preceding a regular council meeting. We get our agendas on Thursdays. Wednesday, we get them a few days before our meetings. This is a week before the meeting for a new business motion. Is that the standard? Is that what's seen everywhere else? And maybe add it to the list of things to debate afterwards. I'd like it to be the same day as a meeting.
Through your worship, practice is going to vary all over the place. So what I can say is I deal with a lot of staff from a lot of municipalities. More time is better.
Sure.
Because there is a scramble, obviously, trying to get that agenda fixed, to get it published, to get it on your website so that the public have notice of what's coming to the next council meeting. So the more last minute things you have, the more pressure you're putting on staff to deal with that. So I expect that's what's trying to be achieved here, is that if there isn't some form of rule, then you slip into, if it's going out at noon, at 11:42, I'm going to get new business added to the agenda. And is there a time for staff to properly assess, for the mayor to properly assess, should it be on this agenda, should it wait for the next agenda? Is there enough staff resources to actually deal with it at the next meeting, that sort of thing?
Thank you.
I can say that our practice has always been, if you're requesting a report, it's considered routine, and so it has generally been allowed same day. That's been our practice for a number of years. Yeah.
Making sure.
Councillor Gardner and then Councillor Hollingsworth.
It was on the same issue as Councillor Bergeron. Your business. I'm okay. The answer's been given.
Okay.
Thank you.
Councillor Hollingsworth.
Well, 2 things. First of all, I'd like to see 19.4 discussed in some kind of formal capacity as well, so it's on the list, fair enough.
Yep.
The other thing, there was, and I can't find the clause, but there was some reference in the procedural bylaw that says councillors have to ask questions ahead of the meeting. And I got I'm speaking for myself, I got a problem with not, in essence, the way it reads, and I can't remember what clause it was.
6.1.1. I was gonna raise it after.
6.1.1? So, let's make sure I know what I'm talking about. It popped out at me and I forgot to mark it. So 6.1, shall prepared a meeting, fair enough, seems reasonable, supplied agenda, facilitate clarification required, members should take steps to make inquiries of staff regarding questions they have in advance of the meeting. I kinda have a bit of a problem with that, Your Worship, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, the whole point of having a meeting is to ask questions and then debate. And so the other problem I have is that, if people are advocating transparency, right? John Q. Public wants to know why we're doing what we're doing, or all the provisions. If I call a manager up, which I'm not supposed to apparently under the bylaw as well, but if I called a manager and said, I have this question, that question doesn't get presented in an open council meeting, and it may never, like, I'm gonna vote how I voted without actually having this question publicly discussed and discoursed, and so I guess we can put it on our list, because I definitely have a problem with that provision as it's written. I'm not sure if maybe I'm missing something. I realize we want to be prepared ahead of time, but I think the whole point of having a meeting is to ask questions, right?
So I'll go to the CAO for a
Sure.
response, but then I want Mr. Fleming to respond.
Sure, if you want to wade into that, by all means.
So
Madam
through-
CAO.
So through you, Madam Mayor, I believe in the code of conduct, council cannot individually direct staff. But I think that council can contact staff directly for routine matters. If you have questions, something has occurred. The only comment I would have around this is that depending on what your question is, if staff are prepared to answer the question, then it might help that item continue to be dealt with that evening. If you're gonna ask a question and you're looking for information, staff try to come prepared to the best of their ability to these meetings. But I know even in my previous role as GM of Finance, some financial questions might get asked. We might not be able to produce that information quickly enough. So I think it would depend on your question, but if you're asking about other examples or past practice or numbers, or depending on what those details are, if you give staff, and it could even be just a few hours notice that day, if we find out midday on a Monday when we have a session that evening, just allows us to be able to gather up that information if it assists council in making a decision. So my only comment would be that by giving a heads up to staff, if it's something that we might not have ready or prepared for at a meeting, it allows us an opportunity to do that.
I guess, if I might, Your Worship, just to, and then I'll, is that whatever we write down here is how we conduct ourselves, right? If we pass this as it's written, then that means that's what we have to do. So if we have it saying, members should take steps, inquiries, staff, and that president in advance of the meeting, I accept the fact that I may have a manager who won't be able to answer every single question I'm ever gonna have, and certainly I can acknowledge that it's incumbent on me to try to be prepared as much as possible. However, during the course of debate, during that meeting at that moment, a question will come up, and in theory, an administrator could say, well, I'm not answering that question because you should have asked that question ahead of time, and I don't even know what the question is because it comes up during the course of a meeting. So maybe it's the wording, maybe I'm debating
Yeah.
over semantics, but.
Mr. Fleming, I don't know how imperative the language is. You may want to comment on that.
Sure.
Certainly, Your Worship. It says should.
Right.
So that doesn't mean it's mandatory. If it was shall or must, then I would say Councillor Hollingsworth is right, and it would be mandatory that you do that. So as should, I think it's a recommendation, a suggestion. And to the CAO's point, I can tell you that my experience with staff across Ontario, they all appreciate the heads up before the meeting so that they can give council the answer that you need. It doesn't mean, even if you get the answer in advance, that you can't ask the question. So to your question or your point about transparency, I wouldn't suggest for a moment that simply because you now have an answer that you couldn't ask the question in open session. And I would actually encourage that, because then the rest of your counselors will have the benefit of that answer as well, and it helps inform the debate. And if you have the answer and you get it in advance, and staff know in advance the question's coming up, even if they can't give you the information in advance, maybe by the time the meeting rolls around, they will have the answer when you ask the question, which helps everybody.
Councillor Towndale, then Councillor Grant.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, since Councillor Hollingworth raised it, I'll say my piece now, because I had a similar concern about this section. I know you just addressed it, but for me it was a bit different in the sense, so we got this agenda for this meeting, or meetings tonight on Thursday, for example, in the afternoon. Well, I worked Thursday evening. I worked all day Friday. I worked Friday evening. I'm in the reserves. I worked all weekend. We had an exercise this weekend. I cracked this open at 11 p.m. on Sunday, and I finished reading it this afternoon just before coming here. That's the best I could do, because I was tied up all weekend. I don't have time to do that. I just can't. I brought this up before when we debated our previous code of conduct. Don't always have time to send an inquiry in advance. It's just not feasible, right? And tying into that, though, because part of it is when we get our agenda. Like, usually we do get it Wednesdays. This one came in Thursday. We have gotten them Fridays before, too, though. That does happen occasionally. But one thing that I want to tie into this, because it's mentioned throughout this article when returns are due to administration, I'd like to see something in here when council should get the agenda. I think we should have it written in our procedural bylaw when council receives the agenda. Instead of getting it randomly on Wednesday, Thursdays, or Fridays, it should be a cutoff. Like the reports due to administration to get onto the agenda, there should be a cutoff for when we receive it as well. I think it's only fair.
Mr. Fleming?
Again, Your Worship, this is council's process, so if that assists council members and staff can make that happen, there's no reason why that can't be done.
So we'll add that to the list?
Yep.
Okay. Councillor Grant has waived his question. Councillor Hébert?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think it's been taken care of. It's more so the language. I know that should is in there, but maybe if we added whenever possible or when possible, you know, at the same time, advance, to have questions in advance of the meeting when possible. I don't know. Maybe that'll make people more comfortable. Should is there, right?
Any other questions? Mr. Fleming?
Thank you, Your Worship. So if we could then jump ahead, I've already talked about 20.3, so 2021, motion to appeal. So this is where there is a ruling from the chair on a point of order, and after that ruling is made, a member of council can appeal that, and these are just the rules for that process. I'm happy to answer questions. I don't think I need to go through that process with council. It's just setting out how that will be undertaken. And then the next article talks about a question of privilege. Point of order is really procedural matters. Have we followed the procedural bylaw? Are we stepping outside the procedural bylaw? A question of privilege deals with the privilege of the member in terms of 22.1 speaks to, integrity of council has been called into question, or individual members' integrity. That can be dealt with in the very same procedural fashion. And again, there would be a ruling from the chair and the ability to appeal that from the councilors. Don't think the rest is that contentious, but again, happy to answer questions on any of those following points. The next point I wanted to deal with was 28, unless someone had something on the intervening articles.
I think you can continue.
All right. So 28 is motion to amend. So motions to amend, whatever motion is on the floor is permissible. The amendment here that I want to bring to your attention is 28.5, which says only one amendment shall be allowed to a motion. I'm not sure if that's different from your previous practice, but I can tell you from sitting through more council meetings than I'd like to admit, sometimes you get, the motion to amend, and then a motion to amend the amendment, and a motion to amend the amendment. And at the end of it, no one really knows what's going on, sometimes even the clerk. This is trying to just streamline that process and say to council, amend it once, vote on that amendment, and then you vote on the motion as amended. And hopefully we're done. There will be situations where there may be debate that drags on, and there will be the potential to amend an amendment. Again, you have the ability to waive this rule with 2/3 to deal with that. Procedurally, you can always decide that the amendment that you've just approved, when it comes time to vote, isn't something that the majority wants, and then you start over again with the original motion, and then you can bring a new amendment once that amendment is defeated. It may be a bit cumbersome, but at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is avoid a situation where council gets confused at 11 o'clock on a Monday night as to what you're actually voting on. This is one of the ways that you can try to deal with it.
So what would need to change here? Are we okay with the way it's drafted here? I just want clarity.
The way it's drafted, you get one amendment,
Okay.
and then you'd have to vote on it. So the question for council is whether you're comfortable with that process. And that's something you can just think about, and when it comes back to council, you can decide whether or not that works for you.
Councillor Grant and then Councillor Hollingsworth.
And if you want another amendment and the majority council thought it was, 2/3 majority thought it was important enough, you can amend that anyway. So
Of course.
it's there, and then if 2/3 agree with it, then, but I like this, that there's only one amendment.
Councillor Hollingsworth?
Councillor Grant basically said what I was thinking.
Go ahead.
2/3, move on.
Okay.
Thank you. The next Article 29, motion to reconsider. So there are two ways reconsiderations happen. The first would be at the same meeting where you've just made some decision, doesn't matter what it is. There is a potential for reconsideration at the same meeting, requires a 2/3 majority of council on the question of should this be reconsidered. And the rules around reconsideration that are spelled out here are, in order to reconsider, one of the members who voted in favor of that matter has to move the reconsideration. And the reason for that is simple, so that you don't have people who lost the vote moving to reconsider. It has to be someone who voted in favor who then changes his or her mind to say, you know what, I think we need to reconsider it for whatever reason. And then there are procedural matters that deal with the process itself. The other way a reconsideration would happen would be at a subsequent council meeting. And there are some rules in here. If you look at 29.8, no motion or report can be reconsidered more than once, fairly obvious. If you've decided something, this provision says that if you've taken steps as a corporation to give effect to that decision, you've entered into a contract, there's litigation ongoing that's dealing with that matter, there is no ability to reconsider. So this is trying to say to council, if you're going to pass something, whatever that something is, if there's going to be a reconsideration, it should be done in a timely fashion. Because once the corporation of the City of Cornwall takes steps to give effect to that motion or resolution or bylaw, it's too late to now reconsider it, because there are legal implications, breach of contract, that sort of thing, that you wouldn't want to allow reconsideration. And then the second last sentence, no decided matter may be reconsidered unless the motion is made within 1 year of the original decision. So just saying again, there is a time limit on this sort of thing. And if a year has passed, effectively you're not really reconsidering anyway. You should really be dealing with a new motion, something that is fresh to council, and there should be good reasons for bringing something fresh to council that effectively is dealing with something you've dealt with in the past.
Councillor MacDonald?
That was exactly what I was going to ask about, so I'm
Good?
satisfied, thank you.
Councillor Bergeron?
Thank you. On that point, would it still require 6 or a majority, 2/3 majority to, on item 29.8?
So if you're within the 1-year period, and if you haven't taken steps to action that item, then it would be a 2/3 majority. If it's beyond the 1 year, or if you've taken steps to action it, it has to be a new motion that's brought to council, a new consideration by staff, a new report, and that report would, I assume, provide council with the information that, well, we are actually in a contract on this matter already. If council wants to do something different, it would require us to breach the contract, renegotiate the contract. So all those factors could then be brought to council, so you would have a new basis for a decision. But to your point, it wouldn't be a reconsideration, so the 2/3 wouldn't apply.
And so, this bylaws wouldn't qualify here. We could repeal a bylaw at
If
any
you
time.
have a yeah, that's a very good point. So if you've passed a bylaw and you come back and want to reconsider it, the bylaw itself has already been passed by council. So I'll use planning as an example, because I have had this happen. A municipality I act for that shall remain nameless passed a rezoning. That rezoning was subject to an appeal by the then OMB. Subsequent, for reasons that are too long to explain, there was a motion to reconsider. And procedurally, it was allowed in that particular municipality. When you do a motion to reconsider, if you get the 2/3 vote, what happens is the original motion that's before council comes back to council, as if it hadn't been voted on. But in the case of a zoning bylaw, you have a bylaw that's enacted, it's on the books. So when that question came back to this particular council and they voted on it, it lost in a tie. But what lost in a tie is the question, should we pass this zoning amendment? Well, that lost in a tie. What question didn't get asked was, should we repeal this zoning bylaw? And that question couldn't be asked because in a reconsideration, that question isn't the question that's asked. So you need to appreciate what you're actually doing, and more importantly, what you're not able to do with a reconsideration. You know, in that case, a reconsideration didn't actually get to the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter was, what should we do about the appeal?
So I'd like this added to the list. I'm not sure how I feel about the 1 year, but last question. This, a previous council moving to a new council, it's the same. There's, a bylaw is a bylaw, motion is a motion, right? There's no
Correct.
differentiation, so.
No. Yeah, so when you folks started your new term, you didn't have to go back to bylaw number 1 and pass them all again, because that would be a procedural nightmare. Every decision made by a previous council is continued with the new council.
Thank you.
So the reconsideration would apply, for example, when you started your term, you could have used the procedural bylaw to reconsider a matter dealt with by a previous council. And the next council can do the same with decisions made by this council.
Okay.
Okay. Those were the key pieces that I specifically wanted to talk about with council, but obviously I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Councillor McIntosh.
Can I go back to 7.8,
Certainly.
dress code? We talk about council members, staff persons, or members of the public when it comes to wearing hats. And then it says, no member, and I assume member meaning councillor, shall wear any shirt or apparel of any kind that has affixed to it displays da-da-da-da. We had a case earlier in this term where a member of the media arrived and had a hat and a message on his T-shirt, and even during the playing of the national anthem, wanted to make a point, and refused to stand. And
Right.
who would make the call on that? Would be the chair?
That would
saying,
be-
you either take that off, change the shirt, or out you go.
Through your worship, that would be at the call of the chair.
Mhm.
So that means the public, you mean, when you say member?
I'm just reading
Member
the
of the
section,
public?
your worship.
Yep. Does that second sentence refer to member of the public in general, or?
So excuse me, 7.8 says wearing of any hats, etc. is forbidden by any member, staff person, or member of the public. And then it says no member shall wear. So that would only apply to members of council. If you wanted that to apply to members of the public, you could certainly add that to that sentence. But as drafted, it would only apply to members of council.
Councillor Gardner and then Councillor Towndale.
Well, we've had media come in here with hats and T-shirts that were anti-mayor at the time, and it's in the past. Is media included in this? Because I didn't hear you say it.
In my view, your worship, media would be a member of the public, but to be clear, council could certainly add that to the list.
I would like to see that happen, because we ended up with the police coming in here and taking them out, so that should be added.
Madam CAO.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So, Mr. Fleming, I think what we'd like to do is reference, depending on what is on the shirt, I think also too, there might need to be a determination if it's part of freedom of speech for the chair, or whether it's, so as far as apparel that might have messages, advertising, or logos, we would often see members of the public that come in that represent organizations that have that clearly identified on their apparel that they're wearing. But there can also be, you know, we've also seen members of the public come in if there's a, I don't want to say the word protest, but maybe they're against a decision that might potentially be made of council. You will see things on their apparel that will clearly make it visible to council that they're not in agreement or they're taking a particular side. So I think that depending on what some of these items are, you know, part of that is also freedom of speech. And then some things could be depending on how the graphics are, depending, like I just think that that's a bit of a slippery slope.
Through your worship, it's an excellent point. By having it only members of council, it's much easier to sort of control the freedom of expression problem.
Not a problem, really.
Well, true. It's the decision that you have to make that could create a problem in terms of, will there be a challenge to the ruling made by the chair to either exclude or not exclude? I mean,
Right.
either decision could be subject to a challenge, I suppose. It's again, it's up to council how far you want to take that particular issue, but the CAO raises an excellent point that it's something you need to consider when you're considering what that standard should be.
Thank you. Councillor Towndale.
And so just to finish up, then, I would like to see that put on the list and talked about, debated after we're done here. There are areas where I think it's been grossly presented in this chamber, and I want to see that debated so we have a way to get rid of, I've got to be careful with my wording here, but when whatever can't be done at the provincial legislature or federal, shouldn't it not be allowed to be done here? And that's what was brought up at the time when we had an issue with a media person. If you can't do that at the provincial legislature, if you
Yeah.
can't do that here, then
I mean, it can go on the list, Councillor Gardner. That's fine.
That's
I
what
I would say that, you know, municipal councils are held to the highest standard of transparency in the world.
yeah, absolutely.
Councillor Towndale.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just to build on that, because, you know, I might get some chuckles out of this one, but for example, the way it's written now, it's no member shall wear any shirt or apparel of any kind that has affixed to it or displays any written messages, advertising, or logos. Well, you know, we all have city apparel. We have it, it's not just the City of Cornwall branding, it's to choose Cornwall branding or something like that. That would technically qualify as advertising, because that's our economic development advertising. That's a logo. Could I not wear that here? Like, so I wouldn't be able to wear a Choose Cornwall shirt representing the city the way I read this. Like, I think, you know, like, I think that's restrictive in a sense, because we are representatives of the city. We should be doing that. Now, I'm not saying I'm gonna wear one for any particular business in town or anything like that, but when it comes to stuff like that, you know, the way I read it here, I can't do that, but I'd want to do that, you know? We
Mr.
have, like, yeah, so.
Mr. Fleming, do you have a solution or answer to that?
Through your worship, if I honestly hadn't thought of that particular example, and that's why this is a good session to have. The simple answer to that particular question would be to just write an exception into this, after advertising or logos, comma, with the exception of
City of Cornwall.
City of Cornwall logos, or however you
Branding.
want to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's tricky. I mean, just recently, we had Cirque du Soleil here. We were very proud of that as a city. And, I purchased a shirt which I might want to wear at a
Right.
council meeting the week after Cirque du Soleil just spent, a week here. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's certainly something
It's
that
a
council
point.
can consider.
Any other questions, comments? Commas, not commas, comments? I think that's good. We took the hour that we said we would take. I do want to make sure of something. I want to come back to the 3-minute discussion rule. I think we will want to talk about that as a council. This is a big council and a very engaged council. It's very good. So our meetings have been lengthy because there's really good conversation in our meetings. Very respectful, but there's a lot of conversation. We're listening to each other. But it can be difficult to manage. So I haven't sort of said 3 minutes for everybody. Most people speak once. I will allow a second time when the debate is especially contentious. But I've kept control of that. But, I think we may want to talk about what we're comfortable doing going forward. So I'm glad to see that item will be on the list for discussion, because I find that when the meetings are long, we've had good discussion, we walk away satisfied with the fact that we've made a decision. We may not all agree, but everybody said what they had to say. So there's something to be said for allowing people to speak for 4 minutes sometimes. But certainly I want to hear more from my colleagues on that. And I understand that it's the chair, but that there's consensus that we need to seek. So I appreciate your comments on that. Anything else? Madam CEO.
I have one last thing for council as well, and it pertains to delegations and presentations coming in and requests coming to council. So we have a
Yes.
limit of 3 per agenda. There are time limits for those as well. But also too, I guess I would ask council if they want to give any consideration to certain criteria with some of those presentations. Because sometimes we have had to decline some based more so on a presentation might want to come in to celebrate or to make people aware of a cancer awareness month or week, and depending on what we have scheduled for presentations, we can't fit it on the agenda. So there would be an item on consent or a proclamation, but sometimes many of these organizations look at it as also an opportunity to come in and speak to council about the importance of what that matter is. So I'm also looking for, or I think we would like to have some thoughts from council, if there is any thoughts with respect to those types of presentations, because we have sometimes a list that is quite long. Understanding that I think there's traditionally been a lot of really good presentations that have come to council, but also understanding complexity of business items, and sometimes we will have departments that will want to make presentations to council as well on more complex issues.
Is council okay with adding that to the list for discussion?
Yes.
Yes? Okay.
I have
That's all.
one more issue I'd like to,
Councillor Gardner?
just a question. In the past, committee meetings like the library or Eastern Ontario Health Unit, the secretary with the minutes and the agenda. My understanding in the past was that every one of those committees had to come back, the minutes and the decisions had to come back to the CAO at the time. So is that happening, or should it happen, or?
Madam CEO?
So through you, Madam Mayor, I believe that Some of those agendas and minutes are made available via access through our website. Most of them are open public meetings. Nothing that I'm aware of ever comes through my office, depending on what motions or decisions are made at committees. Depending on what it is, I could be made aware if we have staff that participate in those committees. We used to have a council information pack that we would email to council with, and it would be a massive
Yeah.
scanned document. Much of that information now is available electronically on the website under where those committees are. So also the idea would be to try and not fill up everybody's email
No.
with that type of material. But,
And that's
so
what-
if there's information that council feels that they're not receiving, that we need to either make accessible or circulate, then
I've seen some of those reports, and you're right, they were that thick.
Yeah.
I mean, the time involved, if there's an issue, the chair of the committee could
Mhm.
bring the issue to the CAO, so, okay.
Okay, Councillor
Thank
Hollingsworth?
Just one quick point, Your Worship, with regards to presentations, for me at least, I think it would be helpful if administration had some criteria that they would like, and we can
Debate.
agree or disagree and debate, but if there's something that you think we really wish this would be a criteria, that I would like to see that as part of like an addendum to the report or an appendix or something like that. I think that might help me at least make an informed decision, if I might. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Grant?
Just timelines for presentations and delegations, it's been way too long.
Okay,
We have to streamline them.
goes on the list. Anything else? So before we adjourn, I'd like to thank Mr. Fleming for answering all of these questions. You can see that we have a council that is taking their procedural bylaw very seriously and the meeting process very seriously. We appreciate your questions and the work that you're going to do as a follow-up.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, merci beaucoup. So I need a motion to adjourn. Councillor Hubert, Councillor Hollingsworth, all in favor? Carried. Can we, bathroom break, bring some food in and get started on the in-camera? Is everybody okay with that? Okay, let's do that.
10 after?
We can eat here? Yeah, 5 after, 10 after. Okay. So 10 after 6, thank you.
Less than that.